You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa.
Welcome, listeners, to our summer series, where we are revisiting pilot episodes we recorded before we launched The Sacred Sofa. These were all recorded in the fall of 2023, and we covered 3 different series. One on power, one on the theological tensions we have with God, and another on the living in the speed of the modern age.
We think there's a lot of good material here, though the content is a little different than The Sacred Sofa, as our episodes followed my teachings quite closely. If you're a follower of the teachings at Nexus, these recordings follow our teachings from this past September to November. And so, to start our summer, we begin with a series on the problem of power. How should we think about power and abuse within relationships? This episode explores all of those dynamics, and we hope you enjoy. All right, shall we dive in?
Absolutely.
All right, well, why don't I give people an overview of what I've been talking about and where I think this could be interesting. So my big question the past year, I'd say, watching some things have hit close to home here in Canada with church and power abuse, sexual abuse. And this is the sort of thing we've seen for those of us in Canada, we've seen it in the States, but it came really close to home here in Ontario. And it's had me wondering, particularly as a pastor myself, how do we prevent abuse of power from happening in the church, Big C Church, of course, our church, but within our lives and relationships as well. And that's been sort of occupying my mind for a while now. And the more I got into it, I was kind of feeling like I'm in the weeds here. There's a lot of mind games we can play. And so I thought this would be a perfect place to start, maybe unpacking some ideas with therapeutic tools along with theological tools. So, that's a huge question. We'll get into more nitty gritty, but how do you respond, Grace, initially to that idea? How do we prevent abuse of power?
So we're going to talk about the challenging news and then end with a more hopeful news.
All right.
Maybe not in this
good.
particular first podcast,
Right.
but definitely in part 2. The answer is we can't prevent it. As long as there are humans who crave power, we can't prevent abuse. The best we can do is educate folks to recognize warning signs and red flags, and then we can encourage people to stay in the safety of community that allows vulnerability and accountability. Shame is what keeps people silent and how abuse continues. And so safety and community is not only for those on the receiving end of power, but those in places of power. And we can unpack that a bit more. Yeah,
well, already you've sort of tweaked my interest here because I think, reflecting on myself as a pastor, and Nexus is wonderful. I've always felt very safe and able to be vulnerable there. But that hasn't always been my experience at churches. And I know other pastors, there's things they can't talk about. And I think the temptation for leaders, anyone with power, I acknowledge I have power, right, is to, when you're maybe struggling, it's kind of back to the Adam and Eve thing. When you struggle with something, you've done something wrong, hide. I want to hide, right? And so that's intriguing to me. Now, of course, also a little disheartening to know that we'll never be able to completely prevent abuse, but yeah, that's some interesting insight. What is it that makes for a safe, vulnerable community? That's a big question.
Yeah, well, you spoke in one of your sermons about the defensive position we often take. If we can have some sense of inner awareness that when we're confronted or approached with things that are challenging, in the realm of accountability, not to get defensive. That's one way I believe that we can invite more vulnerability, not get defensive, be open to constructive criticism, which of course takes practice. And that absolutely is going to begin the path, eliminating feelings of shame without being defensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that was sort of, I had posited in one of the sermons in this series that humility is at least partially an antidote to abuse of power, because the trouble with humility is we all are thinking less of yourself or not wanting the spotlight. But I love the idea of humility as lowering our defenses and how that puts us in touch with our humanity, because it's out of the need for maybe perfectionism or thinking maybe too much of ourselves that our guard gets up. We don't want to be wrong. We don't want to be challenged. And so there's something deeply human about saying, you know what? Okay, this feels maybe like some feedback, some criticism here, but I'm human. I don't have the entire perspective. I could maybe learn something, even if the criticism feedback isn't coming to me perhaps in a way that I love, but there's something about lowering our defenses. Now, the problem is with someone like me, Grace, is I can point to the map, say, hey, we should lower our defenses. But what are some practical ways we can actually do that?
Well, one of the first things I want to do is make sure we're all on the same page in terms of power. Power, and what we're talking about in terms of abuse, is the misuse of power and control. Mm-hmm. Power and control doesn't always have to be negative. We give power over to multiple areas of our lives. Children, we're giving power over our children to teachers. You've talked about power in terms of being a pastor and having authority over, if I could use that word, to parishioners. And even as a therapist, there's a power dynamic at play in that relationship. And so there are three kinds of power that I just quickly want to define. Yeah. This is work taken from Brené Brown's Dare to Lead, as well as Lundy Bancroft. He is an author who's worked extensively for 20 plus years with specifically people who identify as male. And his book is called Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men. So he does a lot of work with misuse of power and control. Not only in terms of rehabilitation and bringing folks to a place of more vulnerability, but also in terms of those who are surviving intimate partner violence. So, which is a lot of work that I do in my practice. So they identify three kinds of power: power over, power with, and then power within. I'll start with power within. We all have, in our terms of our faith and spirituality, the God spark, if you can call it that, if we want to call it that. That's the energy that we have inside, which power with is lending to others, or we use the word empowering. When we're sharing our power with others, that's win-win. Where power goes rogue is power over. And that is where the place of violence and abuse can enter. And in power over, it's lose-lose. There are no winners when abuse and oppression takes place.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. Okay, because I also talked about power with as what we see Jesus modeling and the early New Testament church being the power of presence being among and within. I have so many questions already about what you're saying here. This is good stuff. How do we refrain from getting to that place where we are tempted to exercise power over?
One of the quotes I highlighted in your recent sermon on power is, the temptation is to believe that we know best how to wield power in the world. That's a place of arrogance. That's not a place of power with, in terms of sharing and seeking to understand others' perspective. if we, and this is another quote, we equate being right, just, or worthy as a license to exert power over others. You know, if we're not careful, the position of power that we hold, if we believe that we have the monopoly or the best understanding of how people should be and operate in the world, very quickly is a slippery slope of at risk here.
Yeah. And what I find intriguing about that is, you know, that's a temptation to think we know best how to use power that crosses all sorts of boundaries, right, left. But I think it's particularly a temptation in the church where you're like, we have this message that we believe is good news for all people. So we are right. This is a good cause. And then things start to slip. And I feel like, we don't need to name names, but as I go through the list of fallen leaders and church scandals, it usually starts with at least a measure of success. So a person, a leader, some sort of success, which I think then reinforces, hey, we are doing things right. Look at our numbers are growing. And I can't help but wonder if that starts to feed into a spiral. You can't argue with our success, the measurements we've laid out. And, you know, slowly it becomes, okay, well, I know best how to wield power. That seems like a dangerous place to be. Is there ways to check ourselves?
I agree wholeheartedly with what you just said, Brad. You know, if your only barometer for whether you're right or your cause is just and worthy is based on the success, how many people are following you, very quickly you're at risk of arrogance. And absolutely, this is the monopoly everyone must follow. And you've talked a bit about not only historical oppression in the church, historical as well as present day. I can't help but think of the movie I just recently saw. A dear friend and I went to see Bones of Crows. Not sure if you heard much about that.
I haven't even heard of it. No.
Well, we can talk about my soapbox a little bit about that. But the movie is called Bones of Crows, and it's the docuseries, a short docuseries about the indigenous residential schools. And if you want another snapshot in history, which still the ramifications are even in our current news, these were clergy supposed to be bearers of the goodness of God, misusing their position to abuse and oppress. From history to present, it stems from a misguided belief that we can equate being right, just, worthy as a license to exert power over us. What a prime example of having a good message that we believe to be true, but not giving space for people to have their own experience, beliefs, thoughts.
Yeah, that is, and it points back to humility again, which I don't think, you know, there's systems and stuff that we need to check, but that idea of humility, lowering our defenses, being open to being wrong, because just as we're talking through it here, I think there may be nothing more tempting than truly believing you have the right cause, the right message, whatever it is, and that being a license to power. I mean, it's so, and history is littered with examples of this, right? Now, is that out in case our listeners want to see that film?
Yes, it's just playing more locally. I ended up having to go see it in Guelph, so I'm not sure if it's going to make it into Kitchener-Waterloo, which is part of my soapbox. Why isn't it made more readily available? We're in the smallest theater in the Guelph Cineplex. What's that about? But so you asked me, you know, what are some indicators that, you know, someone is at risk of arrogance, at risk of using power over? And we talked a little bit earlier about accountability. If someone comes to you and confronts or tries to provide constructive criticism and feedback, there are some indicators right away whether the person is going to be receptive. And this is aside from our natural human tendency to, you know, that comment or feedback stung, right? This goes
Right.
beyond that. And there are three main strategies people will use to not take accountability.
Okay.
They are minimizing, denying, and blaming. Minimizing, denying, and blaming.
Okay.
Minimizing is saying things like, well, it was just. Denying could be coming right out and saying, I did not do that, with which you're talking to me about or accusing me of, or giving an alternate version of the incident. Well, I didn't actually do that. We call it like shading the truth. And then blaming. You could actually be blaming someone else or something else. Well, I had a really rough day at work, work is super stressful. You're blaming something or someone else for not taking accountability for how you've created harm. So anytime a person uses one or any of those strategies, they're not ready to take accountability.
Now, is that, as you're going through those, I'm like, good night. I think I've done all of those, at least at home here, right? When something comes up, is there, Kristen and I at home talk a lot about this. It's not just the conversation that needs to be had. It's sometimes when, because as humans, we are that is our posture to get our fists up right away. Is there a way to maybe, if we approach someone with some criticism or feedback and we start to notice some of that, is there a way to, create space and be like, hey, I don't know if you're ready for this right now, so why don't I give you a little space? I don't know. I'm just curious about that.
There are quite a few steps. And again, I'm, pulling from a lot of the work that I do. The first step is to check in with yourself. There's an anagram I use called HALTED. Stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired, excited, excitable, drunk, or drugged.
Okay.
HALTED.
Yeah.
Hangry is a thing. Snickers is making billions off of this concept.
Right.
And it's not just an emotional thing, it's a biological thing. When we are hungry, our body kicks in this emotion, anger, irritability, because it's trying to alert you to, my body has needs. And so I know in my home, often conflict lands around supper time. Right. You come from work, you're cooking supper, all of a sudden things start getting activated. Hangry is a thing. So you got to check in with yourself. If any of these, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, excited, drunk, or drugged, you're not in your right mind. You're not at capacity with which to communicate or receive communication.
Well, that's fascinating. And that rings true to me as well, Grace, around dinner. And that's, wow, HALTED. I think that's something that people should write down. That's a great little thing to keep into the back of your mind there. And an interesting thing for maybe people who have, pastors, leaders, sometimes you go into meetings not knowing what to expect. I mean, that's a quick little checklist to maybe go through, be like, wait, before I walk into this, am I hungry? Am I angry, lonely, tired? I almost forget the E's.
Excited, excitable. Mm-hmm.
Right. Drunk or drugs. Hopefully you're not going into a meeting drunk or on drugs.
Hopefully not. But whether it's a substance or your emotions, you're under the influence. You're not at full capacity. Often, with clients, I say, when's the best time to have a challenging conversation? Some of us don't even know that. I know for myself, it's not in the morning. I am not a morning person. I will not hear or understand anything you're trying to tell me. And so that's not the time to come to me with something challenging.
Yeah, and I've noticed that experience in my life too. I think, Kristen and I, over the years, it's like sometimes as the person with a complaint, it's this temptation, like, I need this out right now. But we set ourselves up maybe for failure when it's like, my need is to get this out, and this might not arrive. Somebody might be busy, hungry, any of those things. So there's some work to do on going, when is this going to be best received, or flagging it for people?
Yes,
I need to have a tough conversation with you. You tell me when the time is right for that.
Yes, absolutely. So checking in with yourself, but also with the person you want to engage with. You know, is this a good time to have a conversation? You know, and then secondly, so check in with yourself, check in with the other person, and then check your motivation. You know, why are you coming with this challenging information or feedback? What are you hoping to gain?
That's a great question too, because sometimes I think what we hope to gain is just a little catharsis in letting frustrations out, not thinking maybe fully forward about what do I hope this person hears, receives. It's just, this needs to come out. Now, maybe, Grace, could you also talk to me a little bit about one of the things that I've encountered in my reading and studying is conflict and abuse are not the same thing. We can expect conflict in life. That's just part of the game of living with people, being in relationship. Is there a way to sort of know, wait, okay, this is conflict, this is healthy. Oh, wait a second, this has morphed into something else.
I love the work of Dr. John Gottman, who's a relationship coach and writer. He says, conflict is inevitable, combat is optional.
Oh, yeah, I love it.
I love it. Conflict is inevitable, combat is optional. We are imperfect human beings navigating an imperfect world. We're bound to bump into each other in some way, whether it's an intimate relationship, how we, walk around in the world. But there's no need to go nuclear.
Right.
Especially if you're checking in with yourself, you're checking in with the other party, and your motivation for coming with the feedback or expressing your needs is pure. There's no need to go nuclear. And if you take the time out, the halted strategy, it takes 20 minutes for that stress hormone to come down. Put yourself in a timeout in terms of just taking space to calm down. You're going to avoid the combat.
That is it. And I thought I heard you just say 20 minutes it takes to calm down from like that defensive.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Minimum, because it doesn't matter if you're running from an animal in the jungle or you're in conflict with your intimate partner. It reacts the same inside your body. Using scientific terms, the amygdala hijack. The amygdala is this organ in our brain that says, oh, I feel threatened. And it's going to push us into instinct. What do I need to do? And so, of course, the stress hormone is going to come up and get us ready to do fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which is a survival instinct. And so you need at least 20 minutes for that stress hormone to come back down to normal levels so that your thinking brain can switch back on.
That sounds like what we all could use maybe is a little more the power of a brief stroll, a little walk.
Yes.
In those moments and situations where we feel our pulse rising. Is it just about time, or is there something about maybe removing yourself from a situation that's helpful?
Yes, both. It's about giving your mind, body time to calm down, regroup, recenter. And it's also about removing yourself from the situation that is making you feel threatened. Whether it's a verbal disagreement or a physical threat. It's all the same in your body. Right. So we're talking about self-examination, self-awareness, ultimately, Brad. Whether it's halted, using the timeout strategy. I really like one of the quotes you had in your sermon by Rick Villadas.
Yes.
I'll pronounce his name
I think
that
it's
way.
Villadas. I'm not quite sure. Yes.
The level of power we hold must be commensurate with the level of inner work we have done and are doing. Otherwise, we destroy people and ourselves. Left to our own devices without the safety and accountability of community, we absolutely can have power over, which includes violence and abuse.
Yeah, when I read that from Rich, it really struck me because a pastor, any leader, needs to be doing their own work. And I think like anyone, you can get into ruts, right? You can get into times where busy things are going on and some of the internal workings stop. And I thought that was a great line from Rich. And, for me, I think it's one of those things where we need as communities to be asking, I think, our leaders, whether it's the elders team, whoever it is, what inner work are you doing? And, one of the things they'd appreciate about you, Grace, is I remember when news first broke about a certain church pastor, I remember you called me and were like, hey, just tell me a little bit about your own boundaries. And it was very much a protective, great thing for a friend to do. Reach out to me and say, what's the work you're doing? What are your boundaries in place? And because it was you, right, and there's a trust relationship there, I felt my defenses weren't up. And it was a great conversation to chat about what's going on in my life. And I think so often in churches, pastors don't have that. Pastors so oftentimes don't have friends in their congregations. They have parishioners. They're the power over. And that meant a lot to me. And I think it is definitely something we need to be checking in with our leaders on. What is the work you're doing? Now, of course, people can lie and make up all that stuff, right? But it's at least asking the question. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And you spoke to something which I think might be a segue to our part two is, you and I have a long-term friendship. And so there's a relationship there. And because of our long-term relationship, there's a safety that has been in place in terms of me providing feedback to you, asking about your safe practices and how you're managing your ministry. But there's also space for those who aren't in close relationship with us to call out certain behaviors or question. And I think we can talk about that more when we get to more on humility and what is true accountability.
Yeah, that sounds like a great place to end this episode, Grace, and we'll pick it up because there's so much more to explore. I want to get into what power does to our heads, but how humility and some practices can at least get us moving in the right direction. We may never fully prevent abuse of power from happening, but we can at least equip ourselves a little bit better, hopefully. So
Absolutely.
Thank you for your time there, Grace. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Brad. This is exciting. I think it's really relevant information, and it's a pleasure to engage with you in this format.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm loving it too. So here's to many more of these there, Grace.
Sounds great. Take care, Brad.
Take care.